Welcome to Talking Roadmaps, the channel where we talk about everything roadmaps, exploring the craft of road mapping. Please, if you're interested, do like, subscribe, and follow the channel. Maybe some shares. We'd love it if you commented down below if there's anything interesting you hear. Today, I'm joined by Tim Herbig. Tim, please introduce yourself.
Hi, Phil. Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, my pleasure. So my name is Tim, coming from Germany today, which is where I live and where I started my product career back in 2010. Lots of interesting bits on this journey, from large-scale corporate publishing to working in professional networking as well. A couple of very, very interesting startup experiences as well, to say the least, with all the usual ups and downs and self-conviction versus real user insights, and some B2B mixed into that as well, just to make sure that things don't get too stale, too boring. And since 2019, I'm full-time coach consultant working with product teams pretty much across the globe, helping them to find their own path toward this mythical word of focusing on outcomes that we all love to talk about in our industry. Predominantly doing that through things like product discovery, OKRs, product strategy, and of course, something like roadmaps that sort of seems to be the glue for tying some of these bits together one way or the other.
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, and funny enough, I'm on your adaptable product discovery course. I am subscribed there and kind of going through it slowly. I subscribe to too many courses myself, but I'm always trying to learn, or trying to go. That growth mindset, I think, is a key thing for any product person. So we'll make sure we get a link to that down below as well when we put this out.
Yeah, good idea.
Great. So, well, let's get to the nub of it. Let's get to the heart of it. In your opinion, what is the purpose of a roadmap?
What is the purpose of a roadmap? So I'm trying to not blame too much on the usual "it depends" response. I would say that for most product teams, the purpose of the product roadmap should be to communicate priorities, and mostly internally. So I would say communicating typically more tactical priorities, more strategic outlooks for an internal audience. And of course, there are different other formats and artifacts out there that you could use to do the same thing. But that's where I would say, if I would have to sum it up in one sentence, that's how I would do it.
Interesting. And so, funny enough, so you said mostly internally. Next thing I always like to ask is, who's the audience? So, yeah, I guess maybe you can unpack that a little more.
Yeah, for sure. So, as I said, mostly internal, I was saying that because there is this case out there that some companies work with those public roadmaps, right? Which are more typically very feature-centric, which is a topic we'll probably get into later on. But this is some kind of external roadmap you could use as well. I would argue that rarely do these roadmaps get used one-to-one internally in the same way, the same format. And so I would argue that the main audience for any kind of product roadmap is probably your own team members, right? Because not everybody might not be always on the very same page of what might be the outlook, the next priorities, because everybody's focused on their craft. It's certainly a vehicle to align yourself with other teams, or to be aligned with other teams if you're doing something like a portfolio level roadmap, to make sure like where different teams are working on within a given portfolio area. But also, of course, to communicate to non-product stakeholders within the organization. Look, like people like the sales team, marketing, or customer service, like, hey, here's how we're addressing some of those issues you brought up, some of the problems we're seeing. Here's where we'd like to go, and communicate that. And of course, last but not least, executive leadership level, to make sure that they get a sort of like very condensed and oversimplified version of, hey, here's what we're going to be working on, and probably also mixing in how we're going to measure success and how we're going to achieve that.
Perfect. And so that, when you say your team, we're talking about a cross-functional product team there, I presume, yeah?
Yeah, so I would, so that whatever your typical product team is, right? I think it's good that you bring that up for clarification, because still a lot of companies think that I'm talking about the product management department when I say product team. And so, yeah, I'm actually referring to the product team and whatever that includes, right? Whether it's the traditional trifold of product, UX, engineering. I would like to argue that most companies should think of the cross-functional team as whatever skills are required to create value as most autonomous way. There are some organizations that might include marketing on the team, that might include data science, analytics, whatever you need.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite to make sure is in there is operations, for example, and testing.
Exactly.
Because often testing are represented by the dev team, and they're complementing
Yeah,
different
that's a
pieces
good
in my
one.
mind.
That is a good one. You could probably get the internet started on this one. Of like, do you have a dedicated QA testing person on the team or not? I always really valued that, to have that person on the team, because they were really like such a great enhancer of engineering quality, right? It's almost like the not to downplay anything, almost like the technical sidekick of the product manager in order when it comes to figuring out, are we building the thing right?
Yeah.
To the ultimate end.
Yeah, I mean, we've got the, are we building the right thing and are we building it right? And the two have to go
Exactly.
together, obviously. Yeah.
Exactly.
So who owns it then? Who owns this work?
I think it might be easier to answer the question of who doesn't own it. I think it also depends on what do you mean by, like, what does owning mean, right? So I would say, I think there should be this, to me, like ownership would mean like who's the core group of people who have to stand in for the choices being made and articulated through the roadmap, right? So ultimately, I would say who owns those prioritization decisions, and the roadmap is just like a visualization communication vehicle for said prioritizations. I think it really indeed does depend on how you have spread or distributed responsibilities within your product team. I would say the typical product trio of engineering lead UX, product manager might be a good starting point to have those continued roadmap discussions. Of course, there might be certain, let's say, domain knowledge between the three of them, who probably has an idea of like, oh, I know about this strategic business priority coming up. I know about this company-wide refactoring coming up. I know about the need to introduce a new design system, which might be in the heads of one of those three people. I think this might be a good starting point of people standing in for the collaborative decisions and actions by a team. So owning them, having ownership in the hands of individuals from each domain of expertise within the product team might be the very diplomatic answer.
Do they all co-maintain it as well then?
I would argue that very often you probably will see the product manager being the one maintaining it as the person like working with the artifact most often. It's probably what you will see. Just as like one of the other domains might work with a specific artifact or topic more often than the others, even though it's a shared conversation, right? So even though the whole team talks about a ticket, might be engineering who does the majority of work in detailed descriptions, whatever, or documentation within the ticket. So I would argue probably the product management role is the one maintaining it. At least that's what I've seen most often. And of course, you could argue that if you have this portfolio level perspective, you might have the head of product / VP of product maintaining the portfolio level roadmap with inputs from the individual contributors or the whole product teams.
Sure. Yeah, that makes good sense. And yeah, I guess, because there is that subtle difference of kind of who's owning what it represents and who actually puts it together. Almost.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's similar to when you think of like OKRs, right? Like you would make the whole team should be involved in the OKR definition process. And of course, you would want to have this conversation within the team every week, every 2 weeks of like, hey, where are we going? Like, do we have to course correct? But there typically is only one or two people who are actually filling in the OKR check-in, right? They're like writing the actual thing and potentially submitting it to someone who wants to review it. So I think there's this differentiation between collaborative discussion and the technical, tactical delivery, so to speak, of the artifact.
Sure. Yeah, it makes good sense. And funny enough, I was about to ask you about relation to other artifacts like OKRs or vision or strategy or objectives. So yeah, maybe unpack that a bit more for me. How does the roadmap link to it?
How much time do you have? No. So the way I see it, I think I've seen plenty of talk out there that people would have to choose between OKRs and product roadmaps. That these are like conflicting artifacts. I think that certainly is not the case. And of course, this comes with a big it depends, right? For example, if you work with OKRs that are very output driven, meaning the key results are pretty much a slightly summarized product backlog, then the question might be worth asking, well, if the OKRs list which feature we're going to build this cycle, what is the additional purpose of a roadmap? Which is fair, right? Yeah. I think it becomes more interesting if you truly embrace this concept of having the OKRs being more outcome oriented and try to stay away from the best practice outcome OKR. Don't try to get too caught up by the best practice or by the book definition, but let's say more outcome oriented, right? Because that's the journey most teams are on or want to be on. If you work with these, I think the biggest obstacle you might hit is that when you talk to non-product stakeholders or even like product team members who just look at the outcome metric, but then ask themselves, but what are we going to do to get there, right? Yeah. So you still need to have that expression of what are we going to do, whether it's a feature or an experiment or an activity, to move closer to that outcome. And you don't want to squeeze that into the OKR itself, right? So you don't want to spread it out even further or have like key result activity in one list. So I think that's where the roadmap can come in really beautifully, because then you're coming from things like you have the qualitative intent through your objective. You have some of the key results that would tell you implicitly which problem you're trying to solve, aka which outcome to drive. And these two could already form one roadmap item. And then you could list as an addition, at least for the near term, like let's say next 3, 4, 6, 12 weeks cycle, you articulate, well, here are some of those current ideas we're going to pursue to drive this key result, to contribute to that qualitative intent, whether it's experiment or feature or something like that. And I think that might be good for the short-term perspective, as in the current cycle, the next couple of weeks looking ahead. And of course, this will change, right? You might not be able to say, these are all the features or activities we're going to do throughout the cycle to drive the key result. Some of these might not work out. So what might be the best guesses, the most educated guesses at the beginning of a certain cycle? I think where it gets really interesting is if you adopt a roadmap format, and just to borrow from this very common now, next, later format. If you look at columns like the next or the later format, then it gets really interesting, because you can't be as descriptive as you can be for the immediate future, because you don't know the OKRs for the following cycles yet, ideally, because that would be quite descriptive. But what I've seen work quite well for some product teams, and honestly, you could argue that this is kind of a band-aid for gap in the product strategy, but to work with annual OKRs, to say like, okay, maybe we are not as clear as we want to be in articulating the product strategy, but we can articulate the key high-level metrics and how they should be evolving at the end of the year. So you could work with an annual OKR, and this annual OKR might give you some input for the next column, at least, of your roadmap, and give you an idea of like, okay, which other metrics, which other intentions do we potentially pursue as well? And then I guess the later column is really about those very fluffy, high-level pieces that might also contribute to your vision being even longer out.
Yeah, interesting. And the now, next, and later format of roadmap being something that Jana Bastow is famous to have created, and she's a previous guest. So, and definitely one that resonates with me. I made that transition in terms of roadmaps in my last organization. Often find, there's that perception that's going to be hard to make that shift. And actually, I find generally it's not, because people realize that it's a more honest way of communicating the direction instead of just moving everything to the right constantly.
It is. I think that's I love that. I don't know who wrote that. It might have been Andreas Sayers who wrote this idea that there's this term of the Kanban roadmap out there, which sometimes seems to be referring to the now, next, later roadmap. And I think what I love about her take, and which really just makes a lot of sense, is like Kanban is about moving things from one column to the other as fast as possible with a certain work in progress limit. Whereas the now, next, later roadmap, it's not about moving everything from the later column as fast as possible to the now column, right? Which would get you in this feature hamster wheel. And so I love this anti-pattern of like not treating the column-based roadmap as something where everything will move as fast as possible from one column to the other. It's not a given that it will be done.
In fact, the now, next, later is almost a use of the 3 horizons concept. And often in the 3 horizons concept, you're already working on the things in the later in order for them to pay off long term. It might be high-level discovery activity and so on that's going on. You just don't know how it's going to land or where it's going to land.
It's true. It's like, it basically supports the whole dual track agile mentality, at least, like there are things in the here and now, quite literally, we have to deliver on. We know how to measure. There are things where we just know that these are mid to long-term strategic intentions, right? It's not even fair to call these a bet or specific metrics. Like that's the direction we want to explore. We have some idea of what to do to explore this problem space, But whether it will ever result in anything like being delivered in the current quarter, or it will ever lead to current quarter OKR, left to be seen.
Now, I wonder, are there any other artifacts that you think kind of link in or relate to a roadmap?
Well, I think you mentioned a couple of these, right? So I believe like product strategy might be incredibly important artifact, because again, this hopefully articulates which specific choices you're trying to make in the future, whether it's about expansion to a certain market, expanding to new user segments, trying to prioritize share of wallet with existing customers, or getting new customers. All of these choices should influence your roadmap and should make sure that specifically those next and later bits are a little bit clearer, and don't just say revenue on them. I think the other bit you mentioned, like product vision, right? Again, extremely important, even though you might find it difficult to link individual roadmap items directly to the vision, because the vision is like supposed to be that far out. And of course, I think the third bit being, of course, previous discovery and previous delivery activities, because all of these should feed back into the next priorities you're working on. So for example, if you're discovering something to continue using this concept in the next column, like you're discovering something, trying to figure out, does the problem exist? Which then might lead to, well, maybe it doesn't exist, so we're going to abandon this roadmap item and not going to transition it into the now column. Or just as you are about to deliver things in the current cycle, and you figure out, well, we can't move the needle. So it might be worth putting this roadmap item back into discovery mode or to another time horizon, or discarding it completely. So it's about like probably all the buzzwords you can name, like all of these to a certain extent influence what you should be putting on your roadmap and what not, and how these things might look like.
So let's switch gears a little bit. Let's think about maybe the design of a roadmap, the visualization, because you mentioned visual a little bit. What do you, in your sort of perspective, think are the key elements of a roadmap?
What content? So and I have that discussion with quite a lot of organizations, because I think it has to be tied into how an organization currently works as well, to make sure that certain artifacts that are non-negotiable will continue to be used. I think should be put on the roadmap item if it helps them with the communication, right? Because if you remember, the roadmap is supposed to be, at least from my understanding, a communication vehicle basically for priorities. And so the question is, how are priorities expressed in your organization, right? So if you work with something like OKRs, I think it makes a lot of sense to, and not just if you work with OKRs, but it makes things easier. But like one ingredient should be the more qualitative intention of what you want to achieve. Not about the specific outcome, the specific metric yet, but just like, hey, we want to, it could be things like differentiate through delightfulness or something like that. Something super fluffy, but which at least like gives you certain high-level categories to put things into buckets.
Almost like a product goal, a little bit like you have a sprint goal, or it could be a roadmap goal, maybe.
Right, like a roadmap goal. I think probably the time horizon might be key, right? Like how far ahead do you want to look, and how fluffy is it okay to be? I think at this level, I think it's fine to be very fluffy. One thing that I love to add to roadmap items, because simply it helps so many organizations to shift the way they work, is to have the problem they're trying to solve quite explicitly on the roadmap item. Because I found that if you just write the outcome, people have a hard time not defaulting to the solution already, right? This constant struggle between outcomes and outputs. And being like using clear and simple English and language, saying which problem are you solving for whom, that's almost like an obstacle for some people to fill in a new roadmap item, right? Because they're like, well, I actually don't know. And it's like, cool. Let's put this into the next column then, and not something we want to try to deliver on in this current cycle. So having people explicitly express the problem they're trying to solve. And again, depending on the team, this might not always be your traditional B2C end user. This might be an internal team. This might be your own way of working. This might be a buyer persona, supporting segment, whatever it is. Then I love getting people explicit about how would the success state of the solved problem look like from a metrics perspective, which could be like a key result or whatever kind of metric system you're using. So like, when would you know that you have solved the problem in the form of a metric essentially? And then again, adding things like the features or experiments you're pursuing next, trying to drive this key result, aka to solve the problem.
And I heard you say something really subtle there. You said it once briefly, and who were you solving it for as well, which I think is a really key part of that, because that problem might exist for 10 customers, and choosing one,
Exactly.
you're going to deliver a particular solution, not necessarily to all of them.
Which ties in perfectly with product strategy, right? Because I think strategy is about making these high-level choices, right? And if product teams are always only talking about solving problems for everyone, or just talking to random strangers, or using built-in user recruiting panels of user testing tools, which is my nightmare, quite frankly. If you just use pre-built panels without knowing the context of them, it's like, well, it's the same as like going out to the streets and asking random strangers. And honestly, if you're building something super generic, like a dating app, this might work, right? But as soon as you're getting any kind of more specific, leave alone B2B, this feedback from the street is pretty much worthless if this is not an overlap with your target audience. And this explicit expression of who are we solving for, love that as an interesting boundary for people to articulate where they're going.
Yeah, and I also love that kind of statement of yours that if you don't know it, then we can't work on it now. It's like, if we can't articulate what the problem is and who it's for, then of course we can't work on it because we've got to figure that out. That's a fundamental.
Exactly. It's quite, I observe a similar situation when people are on the goal definition processes and they land on a really good metric they could use as a goal. But then they realize, oh, we can't measure that goal yet technically, right? So we don't have the measures in place to measure the goal. And then one of two things happens. Either they abandon this great goal and go back to an evergreen generic KPI because that's easy to track, or they set a new goal, which is about create measurability for this very important goal. And I love to push teams to the second option, right? To make creating measurability a priority and an actual thing. Also for your roadmap potentially, right? Because then your objective or your qualitative statement shifts from something like, we delight accountants in Asia by, I don't know, integrations, whatever might be a shitty statement, toward we understand how to measure success for accountants in Asia. Right? It's like this would be the actual prerequisite for working on meaningful metrics.
I love it. So, I mean, we've talked about maybe some of the things that go in there. What about visualizing it? Do you have any preferred ways of visualizing or styling for roadmaps?
Ooh, that's a good one. I love simplicity, so I love the very plain now next later format with like a roadmap card with like some color-coded labels potentially. Again, I think it depends on how many aggregation levels you're having, or sometimes I'm working with product portfolio within a company which consists of 8 product teams. And I would probably introduce like swim lanes, to be quite honest, to make sure that you're not trying to squeeze in competing priorities from 8 teams into one column. So I think as soon as you're trying to cover two or more teams, I would love to work with swim lanes to make sure that every team has their own priority articulated. Other than that, are there more roadmap visualization styles? I think I probably haven't seen enough.
Funnily enough, it's probably another few months down the line, we're going to be throwing that question out to the world saying, show me your roadmaps. Because, there's so many I've seen, there's so many my collaborators just in a scene, there's so many the people we're interviewing have seen, but we want to try and build that library almost.
It's interesting, specifically with like product management tools being on the rise for quite a while. I guess you will find a lot of like very similar looking roadmaps because almost every product management tool has an underlying philosophy, right? Like from the founders or the product people, like that goes into how they approach things, like ProdPad and Jana Basel being the most prominent example, which clearly the way ProdPad handles roadmaps is informed by Jana's perspective on roadmaps, rightfully so. And I think you'll see that throughout some other roadmap product management tools as well.
You certainly see it with Brian DeHaff and AHA as well. My collaborator is an ex-AHA team member, so kind of we see the different styles quite a lot. And in fact, so you hinted at a couple of tools. I dare to ask, do you have a preferred tool?
I don't have one. I love to throw Jana's name out simply for the reason that honestly, it's been a while since I used ProdPad, but just for the what she has done for the industry in terms of like shifting the perspective on roadmap. So I love to give kudos to her and consequently to ProdPad. I honestly try to stay away from the tool discussion as much as possible because I feel that it's a bit of a, what's the right word? I think I'm not sure how much the pure roadmap feature, I'm not sure how much differentiation is in there. I think where the tools shine is everything they build around the roadmap. So like how holistic is the understanding of the tool of what goes into a roadmap. I think that might be the differentiator. Honestly, I love getting started with something like Mural or Miro, something very free form and like without a lot of structure, just to figure out the general sentiment. It's similar with like to OKRs. We would say like get started with Google Sheets or Excel, get a sense for it, and then once things get more complicated or want to commit to it even further, or you found your groove, like choose a tool that suits your needs.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I agree wholeheartedly. I was close to sourcing a tool in my last corporate role. I am a part of ProdPad these days. It was a different tool I was going to source, but I tried to stay agnostic because it's all contextual. Depends on that organization set up. So yeah, I feel your position and understand it well.
And it's always interesting because like many companies want that specific recommendation for the tool, right? And I think again, it's so difficult. It's like whatever tool, I think you can tell a lot about how well the tool might fit for a company, but just looking at the landing page, because they articulate their stand, like what's their perspective on product. I think this is almost to me more important than the actual feature bucket list. There are certain hard facts I would look at. I would look at things like the integrations, I think, which is super important to make sure that the tool can play nicely together with existing tools you're using within the organization to ease the adoption of the tool and the regular usage. Other than that, I think it's more about the attitude and like a certain baseline quality execution.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, now let's get on to switch gears again a little bit. What do you consider to be best practice in terms of road mapping?
I'm just coming off a conversation, so I love to avoid the term best practice, to be honest, because I think it paints a picture of it's this or nothing. Of course, this is like depends on the people interpreting it. I try to be a little bit more, again, like you could argue diplomatic, or I would say realistic, which is like more like better practices, right? So it's like depending on the context you are in, what could be a teeny tiny bit that would help you to make things a little bit better already without getting intimidated by the over-glorified perfect by the book example. So yeah, I think some of the better practices, which could be stacked or like tackled individually, is I think switching from the traditional long-term Gantt chart to a column-based and more loosely defined time horizon. I think is a great thing. Making sure you can connect your roadmap to the other artifacts you use in your company for prioritization, like OKRs, or if you use any kind of scoring, like make sure that these things go hand in hand together. So don't try to create a parallel universe, but connect it to the other bits and pieces that go on. Because again, those prioritization decisions are already happening. The roadmap is more like the window you're creating to communicate it more easily for other people. Regularly update it. Sounds obvious, but isn't, right? I think there doesn't have to be a fixed cadence for when you adopt it, and you might not want to rearrange it every week, but like make it part of those like goals, strategic discussions you're probably having at least once or twice a quarter. Might be a good idea. I think I would, and then having like bringing the clarity around the problem and the measurement of success in there as well, right? So don't go straight from broad qualitative statement directly to feature or activity, but make sure you have this middle layer of problem worth solving and potential success indicators in there as well, to make sure that you're not spinning your wheels to like, oh, we moved the item, we ticked off the boxes, we built the feature, so we are successful, right? Which is, of course, the broader discussion. And I think probably the last one, just inspired by the last bit of our conversation, like not over tooling, right? So don't like try to over tool it, if that's a word, I don't know.
Works for me.
So yeah, it works, right? It's like don't over tool your roadmap approach. That's a nice headline. This should be something to consider. Again, this doesn't go against roadmap tools per se, but like against the idea of starting with a tool and modeling your roadmap approach after the tool. I think it should be the other way around.
Yeah, love it. So let's flip the other way around. What's the biggest mistake you see on roadmaps?
The biggest mistake? I think like leading with the feature and treating time horizons on a roadmap as it has to be done by then, right? I think most of the time I would rather embrace like a best effort approach for the teams, like whether it's in the discovery or the delivery space, doesn't really matter. But like there has to be an intent to deliver as many or best possible features to drive a certain metric forward or to reduce uncertainty as much as possible. I think this should be the goal within the roadmap, and be a little bit more flexible when it comes to when is a roadmap item really done. Is it like only if the last spec of a feature has been delivered to the pixel, or is it like if you're close enough to the metric you try to move, and like it's fine to switch gears and to no longer focus on it. I think another anti-pattern might be to completely neglect the idea of the need for potentially more specific timelines having to be articulated for very teeny tiny delivery, right? I think I don't know if it was Cito Lombardo or Jana who I heard it from, the idea that there might be the need for like a more tactical release plan with specific dates to accompany something like a clearly articulated roadmap, and that these two things can be two different artifacts. It's probably still mind-blowing to many, many companies. So even though I love the more loosely defined time horizons, I think it's important, specifically in large organizations, to acknowledge the need for more specific date-oriented statements around when something will exactly be released to coordinate things like go-to-market initiatives or customer service.
I mean, and that sometimes comes up at that discussion point of other related artifacts. And I you kind of that separation. I think John Cutler also talked about we need to understand the jobs to be done of the roadmap, which kind of is trying to say the same thing. We're trying to do many things with one tool, and actually maybe a few separate ones would make it work better.
Exactly. I think that's an interesting balance to strike, like making sure that you're focused on the jobs to be done of the tool you're using, and like not trying to combine too many things into one tool, then becomes a roadmap item becomes a 2-pager almost. But at the same time, I would argue, not making it too granular and have too many atomic artifacts floating around, where it's then very difficult to piece things together and how things are related to each other.
Whose advice do you listen to about road mapping?
Jana Basto, without much hesitation. Cito Lombardo as well, predominantly for his work on the Roadmap to Relaunch book, which is a staple of my bookshelf, even if you can't see it right now. Obviously, his co-authors as well. And honestly, I love listening to practitioners within organizations who own the craft of establishing processes that work, right? So that would be people in the product ops space, for example. Lots of companies I work with have really mature, very well-established product ops organizations who spend a lot of time thinking about exactly this kind of question of like, how do I make roadmaps a useful tool and how can roadmaps become a useful tool that support this change, this larger shift from outputs to outcomes? Those would be some of the people I would love to turn to. And again, like people in the product ops space, because they have to figure out like, how do I make this a craft that ties in with other efforts and becomes actually useful without just introducing a new framework for the sake of it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's an interesting kind of growing area. It's that product ops. I mean, I look back to the last team I ran and realized I was doing it without calling it. There was one member of my team who was clearly doing that activity.
Exactly.
And now have a label to put onto it, what he was doing.
Exactly. Which is good for our industry in a certain way, at least, because I think it helps create this explicit awareness, right, for this need of this role. And you can now put a position out and hire for this role and get budget for this role without making it an additional responsibility for people. But of course, we should be careful to not like overload it and like make sure that it stays practical.
Yeah. And so you've mentioned some names. Are any particular resources beyond the Roadmap Relaunch book that you also use or recommend?
That's a good one. It's my go-to. There is this, honestly, the one resource I go back to, which is related to the book, is from the Mind the Product talk from Cito Lombardo. I think it must have been at Mind the Product San Francisco 2017, He gave a really good talk summarizing honestly, I think it's still the best talk. I don't agree with everything, but it's the best talk summarizing some of the key bits and concepts. And it's a nice storyline, right? So, which is, I think, what makes it so good for communicating it to executives and sending it over, because it's easy to digest, even for people not being in the trenches.
I might have to go back and look for that. I probably have watched it at some point, but there's so many things I consume.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
but I always like to check things out again.
Yeah, other than that, I wouldn't say my go-to resource. Like it's the things like ProdPad blog. Obviously, like without turning this into like an unpaid ProdPad promotion, but also, as I mentioned, Andres Sayes, who is a former product marketing manager from ProdPad, who I think is also really, really spot on in that space.
Now the hard question. If you had to distill your philosophy on road mapping into 1 or 2 sentences, could you, and what would it be?
What would it be? I think my key philosophy would be to find a roadmap format that supports the organizational change you seek to create, whatever that is, and work with explicit prompting questions to help people fill it right. Sounds completely wrong, but I think you get the idea. Without telling people, oh, this is an outcome roadmap. We now put outcomes in a roadmap item. That leaves too much interpretation. So I think create this explicit understanding of what kind of change in thinking you want to create through the roadmap, and design the roadmap accordingly, whether it's through guiding questions, templates, fill in the blanks, whatever it is, or tools.
Cool. So then I'm going to ask you the classic, I forget who it comes from, it might be a Steve Blank or something like that. What should I have asked you about road mapping that I haven't?
What's the roadmap item I'm most ashamed of ever putting on a roadmap? Would probably be a fun question.
What's your answer then?
I have to admit, I'm not sure if I actually put it on a roadmap, but it's certainly something that it would have been on an artifact like a roadmap level, which was a startup I was working on, which was trying to disrupt the dog sitting industry. And we're building a mobile app doing that, with none of us owning a dog even, but we're very opinionated investors. And so one project we committed to was we had a map with little pins or points of interest on there. And we made it a priority to add a drop shadow to those pins on the map so they're easier to spot.
The inner designer coming out of Tim there.
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, this was more of a semi-forced effort of like, hey, our investor being like, honestly, like 60 plus non-digital native are saying, it's difficult for me to find the pins on the map. We should make these more visible. We're like, okay, let's add a shadow to it.
Tim, it's been great having a chat with you today. Last few seconds, here's an opportunity to give a pitch for your offering so that people, if they find you through this, can get in touch and get your help.
I like to pride myself in talking more about better practices. And so I think that's what informs most of my content. So if you're interested in better practices that help you improve from wherever you are on your journey as a product team, make sure to check out my newsletter, go to my website, herbig.co, and I try to distill fun thoughts like shared in the last couple of minutes with Phil. And this newsletter every week goes out, except for the upcoming summer break. So yeah, would love to welcome some people there to get some perspective on my thinking.
I will make sure the link to your site is visible and available for people here. So awesome. I say, Tim, thank you very much for your time today. It's been great talking, great to reconnect. As for the whole world, I'd just like to say, please remember to like, subscribe, and share all those useful things that help the channel get found. You'll obviously see some shares on LinkedIn and stuff like that as well. If you'd like to take part, if you'd like to do what Tim's just done, please do reach out, get in touch. We'd love to have you. We'd love to have a conversation. Thank you again, Tim, and see you next time.
Thanks so much for having me.